Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles T. Brown, and on behalf of America Walks, I would like to formally welcome you to today's webinar titled Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America, a conversation with author Angie Schmitt. I'm a senior researcher with the Voorhees Transportation Center and an adjunct professor at the Edward J. Bowser School of Planning and Public Policy, both at Rutgers University. I'm also a board member with America Walks and the creator of our web series, Walking Towards Justice. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Kelsey Card of America Walks, who is responsible for pulling us together today in such an orderly fashion and making sure things go as planned. Before I introduce Angie, I would like to start by thanking our sponsors. We are grateful to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention for supporting this program. We would also like to thank our other sponsors, APBP, MIG, and Better Health, for all the work that they've done to assist us throughout giving these web series to the public. If you have a question, you can go to the question box here and type in your question, and Kelsey and I will be sure to acknowledge your question, and we will certainly respond to that question or ask that question of Angie or myself if we have time. Please don't be shy and be sure to ask as many questions as possible. And again, I'll do my best to get to each one of them during the time allotted for today's discussion. I would like to begin by thanking Angie for reaching out to me to advise on her new book and to draft the foreword for the book. You can, of course, read the entire foreword when you purchase the book, but until then, here are a few words from my foreword. It reads, I'm most often asked by well-meaning persons, usually racialized white persons, what can I or we do as allies to aid in the eradication of pedestrian injuries and fatalities in low-income and minority communities across America? My short answer usually stresses the importance of intentionality, empathy, and the courage to act expeditiously. Henceforth, I would add to my list, follow Angie. So with that being said, I would like to introduce our today's guest, my friend Angie Schmitt. Angie, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much for that great introduction. And thanks for all your help in this process of putting the book together. I'm going to start, this is a presentation I've traveled around and giving a little bit, and it's going to explain what I've been calling the pedestrian safety crisis in America. And I think this opening slide is just a good visual about, you know, the kind of conditions people are facing in the United States just trying to walk. And I see it as a little bit of a justice issue. Now, when I talk about the pedestrian safety crisis in America, this is what I'm talking about. In the past 10 years, approximately, we've seen about a 50% increase in pedestrian deaths. So why is that occurring? This is what the book I wrote tries to get to the bottom of. And I think part of it has to do with issues of inequality in the United States, right? So like this is an image from Streets blog. When I worked there, we used to do Sorriest Bus Stop in America competition. And it was sort of a lighthearted way to look at this infrastructure inequality. That's a big part of our lives, but that also goes unnoticed. And I think part of the reason it has been a little bit overlooked in the United States, and a part of the reason this issue in particular has been overlooked, is because the people that it's impacting are often marginalized in a variety of different ways. And I just want to, and a lot of us who are more privileged, including myself, people who are in positions of influence in business, in the media, in government, just are not put in this kind of position that we see this woman in this picture, with 2 children waiting on the side of this high-speed road with no curb in a dirt ditch to wait for the bus. But that's the reality. A lot of people are living in the United States that don't have cars in particular. So I think the way this has been discussed in the media has been a little bit problematic. And again, it goes back to sort of the privilege of the people that are commenting on this a lot of times, and the people who are in positions of influence. So like, I think a lot of times you'll see a column about this in the newspaper or some publication, and it will be like a guy ranting, you know, about how he's mad he saw a pedestrian jaywalking, for example. And I think there's a stereotype that the kind of person that's getting killed walking is this guy on the left, right? And he's like, he's a millennial, he's very wired, he's walking across a crosswalk, maybe in a city like DC. That's where our influential columnists live in the United States, right? And many of them drive to work, and this is the kind of thing they see. But the reality is more like the situation on the right. And this is a guy, this was taken, I took this myself, in a suburban area outside of Cleveland, where somebody is just running for their life at an intersection that, I think this intersection did have a few crosswalks, but it didn't have 4. So he doesn't even have a crosswalk. So again, it comes back to inequality, I think, and different ways people are marginalized. And one of the themes in my book is racial inequality and racism and the way that plays into it. And here's a graph produced by Smart Growth America, just showing the disparity in who's being killed by race. And you see that Hispanic folks, Black people, and Native folks in particular are at increased risk for being killed while walking. I think a lot of us already know that. Older adults, this is something that hasn't been talked about enough. As the United States is aging, we have more and more people in this category that's at increased risk to be killed, have physical vulnerabilities if they're hit. So actually going back as far as 10 years, the CDC, some research had predicted that pedestrian deaths would increase as the population aged in the United States. And I think that's a factor in why we're seeing that big increase. Okay, so we talked a little bit earlier about how people, Black and brown folks, are at increased risk to be killed. Here's a way this plays out in a US metro. And this is a map of Detroit. And this is where it's a heat map of pedestrian wrecks. So I don't know how many of you are from the Detroit region or are familiar with it, but if it was in person, I'd ask people to guess, what's this red line here at the top? Who can tell me? That shows 8 Mile Road. And that's a very famous landmark in Detroit. I may be dating myself a little bit, but there's the Eminem movie that's all about it. But 8 Mile Road is a big socioeconomic and racial dividing line in Detroit. In fact, there were walls constructed along this road in the segregation era that remain to this day along 8 Mile Road. And so south of it was Detroit. The city of Detroit was primarily Black and remains primarily Black. It's about 85% Black, Detroit, to this day. And then north of 8 Mile is not only the suburbs, but a different county. So you have Oakland and Macomb County. Those are primarily white. And you can see how pedestrian crashes are concentrated in Detroit. Just to give you a better perspective on that, here's a racial dot map of Detroit. It shows Black people are shown in blue, and white people, for folks who are less familiar with Detroit, is red, obviously. And you can see very clearly 8 Mile Road there. And also you can see, another thing I want to point out, you can see actual radial streets in Detroit pop out on this map. Those are, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the most dangerous road in Detroit. This is it, it's pronounced Gratiot. And it actually has a very different spelling, so I feel weird spelling it, but that's how it's pronounced in Detroit. And as you can see, actually this road has some features. It's definitely not as bad as that first road we looked at, right? It has some features that a lot of roads don't. It does have sidewalks, it does have crosswalks, and it does have curb ramps, and it does have a bus shelter. But even so, you can see the distribution of space here compared to the users is unjust. There's really a lot of people using the bus stops, the sidewalks, hardly anyone is using that very wide road. So we see this kind of pattern, not just in Detroit, but throughout the United States. Low-income communities and Black and Brown communities oftentimes are just not getting the kind of safety treatments that they need to be safe. Now, here's an example close to where I live in Cleveland. And this blue line, again, is an important socioeconomic barrier. It's the border between Cleveland and Shaker Heights. And this part of Cleveland is primarily Black and very low income. And then north of the blue line is Shaker Heights, which is a higher income suburb. It is a little bit of a mixed race suburb. But the important thing to know is that it's wider and higher income. And you can see these are close calls, hits, and injury hits. That's what the blue, yellow, and red dots represent. So you can see there's a big disparity across this line. And one thing I want to point out is I don't think this is all related to street design. Shaker Heights probably does do their streets a little bit different than Cleveland. But there's other factors as well. And one of the big ones is I think people in Cleveland are just doing more walking than people in Shaker Heights. People in Shaker Heights are probably doing most of their commute by car, and people in Cleveland are doing, lower income folks are doing a lot more walking, a lot more bus riding. So continuing sort of on this thread, here's a really nice map that was made by the Portland Bureau of Transportation. They're looking, to their credit, they're looking at this stuff very closely in Portland, and we all know that city is sort of a famous example of a city that's pretty walkable and pretty bikeable. But if you can see on this map, what they did here is, I think it's a really nice map to try and humanize the problem. And it shows traffic fatalities with the names of the victims. It's fairly obvious. But if you look at this map, I think you can really see the concentration there over on the right side of the map. And that's all in an area, mostly all in an area called East Portland. So just moving ahead, you can see on this map, again, from Portland Bureau of Transportation, it shows the 30 high crash intersections in Portland. And 28 of those are in East Portland. So East Portland is east of 82nd Street. And it's the part of town that's lower income, much higher proportion people of color. So why is this occurring? I talked a little bit about how there's a little bit of institutional racism. People in certain neighborhoods have been passed over for the kind of safety amenities they need. And one of the stories I highlight in my book is, as we talked about earlier, Native folks are at very increased risk, almost 5 times higher than the average for the entire population. And this shows an area outside a reservation in Minnesota. And there was a couple of researchers from the University of Minnesota, and they went out and investigated, why is this occurring? And what this shows is part of the conditions that lead to the problem. So reservations and tribal lands a lot of times function a little bit like a traditional village or more of an urban area where there's a good amount of walking going on. But they're often in more rural areas where the streets are very dangerous. Like this is just a state highway. And across the state highway, so it's between some tribal lands and a food store. And as you can see, residents have worn paths through the grass to this state highway that has no accommodations for them to cross. And the research team, they went out and they talked to people living in this area, and they said, this is a top concern for us. We know pedestrian safety is a big problem, but the people at the state DOT really weren't getting the message. They kind of were dismissive of locals' complaints or tried to sort of blame individual behavior like drunk walking or drunk driving. So there was sort of a cultural rift where the people responsible really weren't listening to or hearing from the people in the local area. So another factor, we talked about how racism affects who is able to get what kind of amenity. But there's also some demographic changes going on that I think are really important to understand. So this GIF, again, is showing the Detroit area, and it's showing racial change over time. And if you look back at 1990, very stark segregation. But over the last 20 years, and we don't even have the latest data from 2020, so it'll be interesting to see that. But it's broken down sort of to a remarkable extent. Now, Detroit is still very segregated, but this is a pattern that we're seeing across the United States, where suburbs are becoming more diverse, whether that's because there's gentrification in the central city, or also just Black middle class moving out to the suburbs, right? So not only are suburbs becoming more racially diverse, they're becoming more economically diverse as well. And that presents a safety problem because these suburban areas north of Detroit were developed a lot during the 1960s. That's the same for anywhere. I talk a lot in the book about Atlanta as well. And they were never designed with people in mind, with people walking. There are a few suburbs of Detroit that are streetcar suburbs, but a lot of it, are two-car garage sort of sprawl. And the streets are really dangerous for folks that depend on the bus or walking. So another demographic factor that's contributing is just population change, wider demographic trends across the United States. This map is from Smart Growth America, Transportation from America, and it shows the most dangerous states for pedestrians in the United States. A lot of you have probably seen this or are familiar with this research, but the most dangerous states are almost without exception in the Sun Belt, especially Florida. And this is the region that's been capturing the lion's share of population growth in the United States over the last 10 to 20 years. And there's really no sign of that changing. So as more people, not only are more people who are at higher risk moving to suburban areas that are more dangerous, we're also seeing a lot of growth in exactly the parts of the country that are most dangerous for pedestrians. Okay, so at this point in the presentation, I just want to shift gears a little bit. We're talking about, in the first half of the presentation, people in the United States are becoming a little bit more vulnerable. We're growing older, right? And people who have particular risks are finding themselves in more dangerous locations. More people in suburbs, more people in the Sun Belt. A third factor is cars. There's been some really big changes in the vehicle mix in the United States. And this map shows it really nicely. It's from the Detroit Free Press. But during the last recession, or in the recovery from the last recession, there was an enormous shift in the kind of vehicles Americans were driving. We sort of traded sedans in, cars, regular cars like Honda Accord, Honda Civic, in for SUVs, and in particular crossover SUVs. So in the second half of the presentation, I'm going to talk about the effect of that and why that's been so dangerous. So here's just wanted to ask people to take a minute to just take a look at these two cars. This is just a picture I took in a neighborhood. I just want you to notice sort of the size difference. And these are two cars that have pretty much identical seating capacity. There might be a little bit extra cargo room in this first car here, but most of the extra space in this car is sort of in this weird area by the legs. But the point is, cars are getting bigger, a lot bigger. And that has a big impact on pedestrian injuries. So I took some pictures just using myself as sort of for reference. And just keep in mind, I'm about a 5'6" woman, so I'm kind of a medium-sized, a little bit tall woman. So for a car like I think that's a Honda Accord on the left, it sort of hits me. If it were to hit me, it would hit me sort of like in the knees or maybe the thighs. But these bigger cars, like on the right, we have that's a Toyota 4Runner. You see that the front end of the car comes sort of right up to my chest. That's much more dangerous to be hit by that kind of car. And some studies have shown pretty definitively now that this helps explain the rise in pedestrian deaths we're seeing across the United States. SUVs, when they strike pedestrians, are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to kill them. And it's even worse for child pedestrians, where the odds are increased about 4 times. And that's from research from the Federal Highway Administration. Another factor I've gotten a lot of mileage out of this image. It shows my son when he was 4, standing in front of a lifted Ford F-250. But another factor, and that's been getting more attention lately, is pickup trucks have become just gigantic. So that's also contributing. Just circling back a little bit to SUVs, this is, everyone knows Jeep Wranglers. They also, another problem with them is that they have some visibility issues related to, in this case, this figure just illustrates some of the visibility issues they present for people who use wheelchairs. And this is a really sad case. I think it was in Tacoma. I took it out of a newspaper story, but the victim in this case was a friend of the driver. And it's a really sad story. The driver just could not see him when he was right in front of the car. So a little bit more about cars and the evolution they've sort of been through. I just thought it was interesting to look at this one vehicle in particular. This is a RAV4, and it was the first crossover SUV. Really popular car. This is the #1 selling car in the United States outside of pickup trucks right now. But if you look back to 1996, it's so little and cute. Like, even the front end sort of looks like it's smiling. It started off at about 2,500 pounds. But I want to walk you through the evolution of this single vehicle over time. So if you look ahead to 2009, it's almost 1,000 pounds heavier. Oh, let me check. Yeah, it's about 800 pounds heavier on the light end. And as you can see, it's gotten a lot bigger. This is the 4-door, so I should mention that. Now, if you look at the most recent version, it's almost 1,500 pounds heavier than the original we saw, and from 1999. And if you look at the front end also, I just want to notice this. It looks much meaner, higher front end, much more aggressive. Those are all features that are bad for pedestrians. There's another factor that's going on in the auto industry that's having an impact, I believe, as well. And there's been this big horsepower arms race in the car industry. So if you look at this map or graph, this is from the EPA, but it shows increases in horsepower. Horsepower has just like skyrocketed over the past few generations, and it has eaten away almost all the fuel economy gains we could have gotten out of the car industry. So that's just another concern, the effect it has on the environment. But I also think as cars get faster and more powerful, it works against what we're trying to do in planning. We're trying to control speed, because obviously speed is so important in predicting whether a pedestrian will survive a crash, or even whether a crash will occur. And planners are working really hard in some cities, like in Portland and in New York, to reduce vehicle speeds, especially in neighborhood areas. But I think if you're in a car that's, a 400 or 500 horsepower sports car, think about how difficult it would be to try to cruise along the street at 23 or 24 miles per hour. I think that, this is one of the headwinds we're facing, people who are trying to address this problem, what's going on with cars. Again, so I'll just walk you through, Mustang, very popular car. Even, in 1999, you could get one with under 200 horsepower. Now, 2019, it goes up to almost 500. So it's really a dramatic increase. Another issue to think about as far as vehicles go is that a lot of vehicles, especially commercial vehicles, have huge blind spots. This is produced by the government in Quebec. And it just shows how enormous the blind spots are around some of these commercial vehicles, big trucks. We're still allowing vehicles like this unmodified to drive into all our major cities, including Manhattan. We're building these nice bike lanes where some figures will show, you know, 10 or 12 people just completely invisible to these drivers. And one point I wanted to make about this is all these blind spots could be resolved relatively cheaply just with some additional mirrors and cameras, but we've never required it. So with that, I want to shift gears again and just talk about like what should we do with this information? You know, that's what everyone wants to know. Sort of how do we resolve this? It's a really complicated problem, so I don't want to oversimplify it. And I think sort of shifting the way we think about this in general is a big part of it. So it's not just about what's happening on our roadways. It's also, and we know a lot of what works on the roads, but we haven't had the will to implement it. We've sort of been blaming the people who've been hurt in a lot of cases. And I think that goes back a little bit to who is being killed. We talked about before how low-income folks, people of color, older folks, the people who are getting killed are a little bit marginalized, and I think that's why we haven't really had the will to address this. But here's a couple examples of things I like. This is a project in Baltimore, and they had a really dangerous street that was really tricky. As you can see, there's a highway in the back, and it was very high speed. There weren't any sidewalks. But rather than make excuses or wait a long time, they just took these highway dividers and they built a safe space. They took out a lane and they built a safe space. And I think it's sort of a shame we don't do that more. And I know that the engineering profession, and this is something I talk a lot about in the book too, can be a barrier a lot of times. There's a very complicated process for what the manuals say is appropriate, and at times the engineering profession has sort of stood in the way of practical changes. But this is something that I think is really cool and should be tried more. And the next example, it just shows how it was done in a cheap way. And this is in Mexico City, just using bollards. They were able to carve out a little safe space there. And that would be really relatively inexpensive as well. Another thing I want to talk about a little bit is lighting. So I'm going to go back to talking about Detroit. The bright space, the bigger bright space you sort of see at the top there is the city of Detroit. And then down kind of at the bottom, you can see the city of Cleveland. Those of you that are familiar with this region could probably guess that. But you notice the way Cleveland is sort of orange and Detroit is a cooler blue or white color. That's sort of a big success story that I talk about in my book, and it has to do with street lighting, which I think has been a really underappreciated topic for not just this issue, but a lot of related issues. So Detroit, in 2014, they did a survey and they found that about 40% of their streetlights were not functioning. They had burnout or they just weren't operational for whatever reason. And going back to one of the themes of this presentation, I think like we in the planning community, those of us who are in positions of authority across different sectors have not been very sensitive to this, in part because of privilege and because, you know, we sort of can take for granted that the streetlights are going to work in our neighborhood. But that's not the case for everyone. And that wasn't the case across big parts of Detroit. And it was a big personal safety issue in a lot of different ways. So in 2014, they issued bonds. They issued $185 million in bonds. And the state was a great partner in this project. They haven't always been a good partner for important things for Detroit, but in this case they were. And they replaced the streetlights. They got them all working, right, over a period of 2 years. And this is a graph. It shows, it was produced by Detroit Greenways. I want to give them credit. They were tracking this. It shows what happened to pedestrian deaths once those got working. So there was actually, I believe it's a 35% decline just over a course of a couple years once they got the streetlights working. And you can see in particular, this graph's a little bit hard to read, but the important thing to know is that this blue in the map shows deaths occurring in dark, unlighted conditions. So at the height around 2014, 2015, 2013, they're having about 45, 46, 47 pedestrian deaths a year. after those get fixed, first of all, dark unlighted deaths dropped to practically nothing. I believe they went down to 1. And again, overall, then they get down to a little, looks like 26 or 27 deaths in 2017. So this is a big, big improvement. One of the biggest success stories I could find. And in addition, I want to mention that this is happening in Detroit in a wider context where pedestrian deaths are skyrocketing in Michigan and across the United States. So that's a big success story for them. And I think we need a lot more attention to lighting. Okay. Another thing, this is just a really simple thing, and I think, again, it's been a little bit overlooked. It's not considered very sexy, it's not very designy, it's not very new, but this is one thing the Federal Highway Administration recommends. It's a really nice, accessible pedestrian island, and I think we need a lot more of these. They're not very expensive, but the federal incentives have been going to highway flyovers instead of this kind of thing. We should be putting these in front of every school in the United States, I think. And I also think we really shouldn't allow transportation agencies to build 5- and 6-lane crossings that pedestrians use without some type of pedestrian island to at least make it 2-stage. So not only should we be adding these on new roads whenever there's a long crossing, this is the kind of thing we can go back and sort of repair roads that aren't very walkable by adding. And one thing that I think that's kind of nice about this is a lot of this stuff doesn't really get into a sort of typical war on cars struggle. Like we see a lot of times on these issues, where adding a bike lane might turn into a big political battle that takes several years, and I like bike lanes, and I think a lot of times that's necessary, but some of this kind of thing really probably wouldn't generate that kind of backlash. It's just sort of hasn't been done for lack of attention or lack of money. And with that, I just want to do another little plug for the book. It's been getting good reviews, and if you want to buy it, you can use this discount code from Island Press. It's just my last name, and you can get 20% off. And with that, I think we're going to just turn it over to a discussion and questions. So thanks so much.
Angie, thank you. Thank you. We're going to get right into it. One of the things that I would ask of you, again, everyone, my name is Charles T. Brown. Good to see you all. Is that since we have like 30 minutes remaining, we're going to do the questions in more of like a rapid fire format. So I'll ask the question as quickly as possible, and do me a favor and try and answer as quickly as you can. No pressure. And I have a set of questions, but then I'll turn to the chat function to see what people have asked. The first question is an obvious one, but I'll ask it anyway because there are a few people who are interested. What inspired you as a former journalist to write this book? Why this book on this topic?
Yeah, so good question. So I wrote for so long about Street Talk. We were focused on biking, walking, and transit. And I think like biking, obviously, and also transit were just a little sexier, right? And I used to be, one of the ways I got interested in this is I was a cyclist and I was a commuter cyclist and doing transportation cycling. But then I had 2 kids. I have a 3- and a 5-year-old, and I couldn't bike. Like when you have a baby, you can't put them on a bike right away. So I just started doing all my trips by walking. And I think that changed my perspective a little bit. Also, and it just got me thinking, like, I thought it was a little bit of an injustice that there wasn't more attention to this issue. There's about 10 times as many pedestrians killed every year in the United States as bicyclists. And I think it gets a little bit back to sort of like the privilege issue I was talking about, where bicyclists were able to command so much attention just because sort of who they were. And there was a lot of, higher income professionals that were really excited about biking. So when this increase in pedestrian deaths started, I got interested in it. And once I sort of made the connection to cars, that also interested me a lot. So I had done so much reporting, not to be long-winded, but I had done so much reporting about this. I thought I was spending a lot of time at night just screwing around on social media, and I thought I should just take this time and write a book because I have so much, sort of stored away in my brain that I could probably just do it in the evenings, after my kids go to bed. And I wasn't able to do it all in the evenings, but it was sort of an impulsive decision, and that's part of the story of why I decided to do it.
Awesome. Bear with me because there's a delay on my end, but we'll make it work. So you began with a quote by Deborah Erzman, CEO, National Safety Council, and the quote in the book reads, "Our complacency is killing us." Why this quote, and whose complacency are you referring to?
Yeah, her quote was sort of about traffic deaths in general. I have to admit, like when I started writing, I wasn't really sure. I wanted to write about traffic safety and like why are we so inured to all this death? Why do we accept so many deaths in the United States in traffic? And there's only a few people that really work on traffic safety, and the National Safety Council is one of them. And I don't know. So I wanted to sort of question that because I think if we cared a little bit more about traffic safety in the United States, we could save so many lives. We could reduce so much suffering, but we just don't. It just hasn't been a focus of attention.
Thank you. In the author's note, you begin with a prediction, where you start by predicting a decline in pedestrian deaths due to the pandemic, but then you change course and say that increasing speeding may lead to producing potentially dangerous conditions as more people are out walking and biking. You're not claiming to be Nostradamus, but how do you feel knowing that you accurately predict?
I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit at the end. You know what? When all this started happening, I had finished. So I finished writing this book before Corona really took off, or before I was conscious of Corona being a serious issue for us, and before the protest movement that's come along. It was written before all that, and watching it happen, I was just like, oh my God, you know, how is this gonna? It's selfish, but like, how is this gonna affect what I'm working on, right? So that was my prediction early on was, and I always thought even before all this happened, if there was a recession, that's one thing that would change how many deaths there were in the United States. We've seen deaths sort of climb since we came out of the recession. Every time there's a recession in the United States, we usually have a little less driving and less traffic deaths. So, but what's weird about what's happening right now is people aren't really behaving like it's a recession. Like one thing I looked at kind of excitedly after this happened was, okay, is the vehicle mix going to change? Are people going to start buying more sedans, which are cheaper, instead of big trucks and SUVs, which is the type of behavior you normally see in in a recession? But we haven't seen that. Actually, I heard that it's gotten worse. So it's really hard to predict sort of what's going to occur. I would though, because of there has been a big decline in driving, at least initially during the pandemic when people were quarantined. There's still a lot of people telecommuting. So I would expect that pedestrian deaths and all traffic deaths will go down, but there are some weird X factors, like I said, about, there's a lot more people doing recreational walking and biking right now, and there's been more speeding in a lot of cases because streets have been emptied out a little bit. So it will be sort of interesting to see what happens. It could be kind of a mixed bag for this issue, I would say.
You had a quote in there or a statement about the president. Um, but the question I have in the context of the statement you had about the president, have we become tolerant and desensitized to pedestrian deaths in this country?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's almost to a weird extent. Like there was a case, I actually cut it out of the book, but I had a thing, an anecdote in there about how there had been like 7 or 8 deaths in the DC area over a short period. And there was a headline about it in one of the local publications, and the headline said basically pedestrians are being lazy. That's why they were hit. And these are people that just died, like tragically, and to be slandered like that in a publication, these are accidental deaths. I just thought, wow, like we would not do that. Even, there are some major causes of death that at one time were quite stigmatized, like, and there still is some stigma around like domestic violence deaths, of course, and suicide, things like that. But I just cannot imagine, someone at this stage, someone dying from suicide and then being, slandered in that same type of way, their sort of character attacked after their death. So I think, yeah, there's a very weird sort of invisibility to this issue. And that's one thing I was trying to accomplish with the book is I think we haven't had like on a lot of these issues, we have like a big breakthrough moment, like with Me Too, with the Harvey Weinstein case. People were like, all of a sudden, the issue of, this sexual predation by these powerful men was sort of, dominating a few news cycles and causing people to really step back and think about that. And all those women spoke up. And so we've had that about a number of, the opioid epidemics is another recent example where all of a sudden, and there's some class and race issues with that have been discussed. There's very sensitive portrayals of people that were heroin users being killed. And we haven't really gotten there with this, I don't think. So that's something I was trying to address a little bit.
Great. Along those same lines, you stated that you hope this book can help planners and other disciplines put the values of care and empathy and caution over habit and convenience to save lives the same way we are talking about, or to save the lives the same way that we are taking on this terrible global crises. Do you feel that these values, care, empathy, and caution, are absent from our profession?
So you're by that you mean planning, I guess. I feel like probably more so than some, but that's a good question. It's a little bit hard for me to analyze planning, I guess. I think, there's been a good critique of planning recently from some planners of color that I've been paying attention to. And I think that they're right, that probably some of the focus has not been where it should be, I guess. What I critiqued more, and maybe this is more convenient for me, but what I critiqued more in the book was the engineering profession. And because I think that they have a lot of control over this, sometimes more than planners. It depends on the setting, but definitely in the engineering profession, I think like there needs to be sort of a awakening about this, or that there is sort of a callousness about it. And I think you know, it's part of a wider culture and a training. So it's hard to, as an individual, maybe sometimes spot it, right? So they might not feel individually responsible. But there are some engineers, some really brave engineers, I think, and I highlighted a couple of them in the book that are trying to stand up to this culture that says 6,000 pedestrian deaths a year is sort of acceptable, or not a big concern.
Great. You stated later on in the book that pedestrian deaths are not random, that they are part of a systemic problem with systemic causes. Which problems and causes are you speaking to? You mentioned policy. Are there others?
Well, shoot, okay. I have to think. Uh, so, the causes, again, I think it's sort of hard to recognize, and because it's just so much a part of our normal way of life. And I do think it cuts across multiple disciplines. Like I talk about the way the media covers this is a problem, right? There isn't a good recognition of the way road design plays into it among reporters, among the general public, right? Among police. And then even in the engineering profession, there's a lot of shortcomings. And like we talked about, planning. So I think from that perspective, and I think that's one of the reasons it's been a little bit invisible. It's like it's not so simple to see. Like a lot of things you can see, and it just plays out, and it's very clear that it's unjust, And this is it's more complex. It's a systemic problem. But I think if we can raise awareness that it's very predictable, that it's happening in patterns, and in a lot of these cases, like I was just looking at one in Cleveland this week because for a little interview I did, I looked up one of the pedestrian deaths we had here recently, and they talked to it was right outside some public housing in Cleveland, a very wide road outside some public housing, and they interviewed one of the neighbors, and the neighbor said this was totally predictable. People have been drag racing through here for years, and it was a drag racing case. And oftentimes you do hear that from the neighbors. Like if they bother to interview the neighbors, say, oh yeah, that it's been a huge problem. We've been complaining about it for years, and there hasn't been any action. So there definitely something is going wrong where people aren't, the people who are close to the ground, close to the problem, aren't able to sort of see their concerns translated into the appropriate changes.
One of my favorite chapters in the book was the profile of a victim, and where you discuss the other Portlands. Do you believe the other Portlands and the treatment of people living in the other Portlands is symbolic of or akin to the other Detroits, the other LAs, the other Chicagos, the other Atlantas or DCs or New York? And if so, how silent of a pandemic is that, or an epidemic is that? How silent of an epidemic is it, the fact that we have these other Portlands that are not talked about in our profession?
Yeah, no, I definitely, like I use that as an example, but definitely I think that that's universal. So like if you look at in Cleveland, I've been doing some presentations where I talk about Cleveland, which is where I live. And if you look at, there's a group called Vision Zero. It's a relatively new initiative. So we weren't even looking at it in a really very organized way before the last 2 years. But if you look at where the most dangerous road segments are, it matches up almost exactly to our redlining maps, to where we traditionally redlined mostly Black people in Cleveland, it would be. But also there's a couple of other segments also in the areas that are heavily Latino in Cleveland. So it matches up almost exactly to what you see with race. I talked about it a little bit in Detroit. Detroit is and some of the Rust Belt cities are a little bit funny because they might not have like a lot of fancy, it might be almost all lower income people of color in a city like Detroit. So yeah, and the other thing is even areas that are more suburban that aren't very fancy, right? Like my sister lives in Fort Lauderdale, so Florida is the most dangerous, right? And my sister is actually like she's not a poor person, right? Like they can afford a car, so that they drive, so they avoid the problem. But in Fort Lauderdale, there's really only like one neighborhood there are one or two neighborhoods that are decent for walking, right? Everyone else can't afford, and they're very expensive. It's like a totally, it's a wealthy community. And I think that's pretty common across the Sun Belt. Like across the Sun Belt, even like a more middle income person, maybe couldn't afford to live in a walkable neighborhood, but would it be able to avoid the worst impacts because they would be in cars and driving? the middle income folks.
Why is victim blaming so prevalent among the media across this country? What advice would you lend to other journalists to stop this trend?
Yeah, it's a really big problem. I would love to do like a presentation just for journalists. There's been a little bit of critique from a few publications now, but I don't think it's really sunk in a serious way. So I used to be a newspaper reporter, so I have some good insight about this. Like I used to work at a newspaper in Youngstown, Ohio, a daily newspaper, and there was just sort of this convention, and this goes back to when newspapers were a different era, but they would like to record every death. They would record every shooting. They would record I think they tried to record every traffic fatality as well. But it was like the kind of thing I would sit in the newsroom, for a 5-hour shift, and I'd be writing up 5 or 6 of these. It would just come in, we'd get a press release if someone died, and it was just a matter of transcribing that. We weren't really investigating. Now the shootings, they were a little sexier. A reporter might spend a little bit of time working on a story about a shooting, but the traffic deaths, not at all. And I think that there's like an instinct for reporters, like, okay, someone died, let's try to make sense of this, right? Let's try to make sense of this story. All I have is a police report, and it says they weren't in the crosswalk. Well, if they weren't in the crosswalk, then we can sort of put a bow on it and say, well, that's sad, but that's the way it goes. So I think that, reporters, what I think would be better for reporters to do is just get away from trying to record all these deaths and really dig in on a few, or look at the deaths in a more systemic way for a couple of articles instead of just these one-off things that really don't do any justice to the victims.
We're nearing the top of the hour, but I want to remind everyone that we're going to go over. And because we're going over, what we're going to do is give away 2 free copies of your book. So if people hang on, near the end of this webinar, we're going to raffle off the names and announce those names here in the next few minutes. So Angie, bike lanes. Let's talk about bike lanes really quickly. Are bike lanes white lanes? If so, what are multi-use paths and trails?
So that's sort of a reference to the book. I can't remember the author of the book's name.
Great person.
But so I do think, like, definitely they've been associated with gentrification, and in cities like New York, they've been applied primarily in whiter areas. Like someone was telling me, if you look at where bike lanes are in New York, it's basically like Manhattan and Brownstone, Brooklyn is where they've been installed. So that's a problem with the geographic equity of those. I guess, I don't know if this is answering your question, but again, I think it gets back to this: who is able to who has the political power to realize changes, to get the government to act on their behalf, to make changes in the road. That doesn't mean, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be installing bike lanes in Black neighborhoods. It sort of depends on what people want, in their own neighborhoods, I think. But there is definitely a geographic equity issue. And one of my favorite lines in the whole book is really from you. And I always, when I talk about this, I'm always quoting you, because you said that in white neighborhoods, people are able to get infrastructure changes, and in Black and brown neighborhoods, people get enforcement. So instead of, a nice bike lane, they might get cops coming out to their neighborhoods, ticketing them for jaywalking. So it's a big equity issue. So I don't know, it's a huge topic. Like, if there's people that are smarter than me that are talking, that are breaking down the racial justice aspects of bike lanes and different treatments from the perspective of people of color, which is something I lack.
Right. And this is more of a question I've seen. I think I mentioned this to you previously, but what would you say to those who say we don't need another white person or a white woman discussing racial issues in transportation or mobility? What's your response to that?
Right. Well, so like I've been writing about urban affairs issues for a long time, for probably like 12 years. And one of the reasons I got interested in it, I think, is just like living in a city like Cleveland. Um, that's been, Cleveland, a lot of people know about the struggles we've had here. We've lost like 50% of our population. And a lot of it comes back to racism. Like, I think it's very hard to talk about cities at all, to do any reporting about cities without talking about racism, because it's shaping so much of what's happening. And I guess when I started this book, my intention wasn't like to write a book about racism. There's people that are writing books that are, fully about like, how do we take on white supremacy right now? My idea was to write a book about this particular issue, but then to look at how it was affected by that issue. And I think once you start peeling back the layers, um, it's at the heart of racism, is at the heart of a lot of our problems. So I don't know. I think that like if it's something like this would have more moral authority, I think, coming from a person of color, totally. And we white people do need to be careful we're not like hogging the spotlight, especially right now, which is why it's kind of weird timing for this book to come out. But I don't know. I'm just trying to sort of, as a journalist, call it like I see it, and I think it's a factor, racism.
Thank you. Um, I'm going to go now to a lot of the questions here that I've seen submitted. We have a lot of people still online here. But one of the questions that I see most often is for statements is that it's all about education. The victims need to be educated. What's your response to that?
Yeah, that's yeah, that's just not going to work. Like, I'm very anti that approach. I think like a lot of times, I think it should be said more often, like a lot of times when people jaywalk, they're behaving rationally. Like they are doing exactly what a rational person would do in the situation they're in. And throughout the book, I talk about, people who were killed where the closest marked crossing was like a 2/3 of a mile detour. And that's just unreasonable. Like we're asking people, we can't ask people in their 80s to make a 2/3 of a mile detour in Phoenix, on a hot day, to use a crosswalk. Like that's unreasonable. So this idea that we're gonna educate pedestrians, first of all, the resources that they dedicated to it is just not nearly enough to reach anyone, enough to make a big difference in the way people behave, I don't think. I talked to this guy for the book, in Sweden, who had been working on Vision Zero there, and he said they don't consider education. They don't think that works at all for Vision Zero. They don't do that. He also said they don't really do enforcement. He said they don't consider enforcement Vision Zero. It was like sort of all about road design for them. But I do think there's some education to be done in the wider culture. Like so much of our culture, people are learning all the time about what's the right way to perceive this, from things like movies where there's car chases or car commercials where people are like racing or flying through a city scene and there's no pedestrians in the way. So there's a lot of cultural baggage around this that's harmful, right? I don't think any of our transportation agencies are spending the resources to really address it, though. I mean, it's hard to go. Car companies are spending like $50 billion a year, and a lot of those messages are really harmful. So, yeah, I don't think it's really very worthwhile, the education stuff.
So someone stated as pedestrians, we have so much working against us. What do we have working for us?
Well, so well, I think I mentioned earlier, I think it's like this issue is an injustice, and I think it's more of an injustice than regular car crashes, because pedestrians are not killing anyone, right? Like pedestrians don't kill people. We're only getting killed, right? That's not an advantage, but I think like morally, I think if we could reframe it, and right now a really harmful sort of rhetorical convention is to say, well, both sides are equally guilty if someone gets hit. And then I think we have to reframe that. It's like, no, pedestrians are doing this harmless activity. They may be children. They may be visually impaired. We need to try to look out for them, right? The government should be on the side of protecting them, not instead of just trying to ease car commutes and excuse that. I don't know if that really answers the question real well, but I do think like you can make an argument that pedestrians really deserve special protections, and I think it's sort of hard to argue with morally in a lot of ways.
So you have present on the call today a number of engineers and a number of planners as well. Someone has stated that the engineers have control over this issue or these issues. Planners have absolutely no power on this issue. What's your response to that statement? Are planners powerless?
No, of course, I don't think planners are powerless. A lot of times the engineers are given the final say. And I think that's should be looked at again. Like in Ohio, I recently shifted gears in my career, and I'm trying to get more into doing consulting and doing some work at trying to advise cities how to make their streets safer. And if you go to the Ohio Department of, this is just an example, if you go to the Ohio Department of Transportation's website, I was like looking, well, can I, as a planner, I have a master's degree in urban planning, can I be pre-approved? Can I be a pre-approved consultant? And guess how many things in Ohio I can be a pre-approved consultant for with a planning degree? It's like 0 things. I can still do some consulting, maybe, but they require, to be one of their pre-approved consultants, you have to be an engineer with 3 years, or you have to have an engineer on staff with 3 years of experience. So there is, I think in the engineering profession, I think they've been very successful at sort of conserving their power, right? And I do think, like, I mentioned this to Charles before, I think it ends up being a little bit sexist, because I think engineering is like overwhelmingly male, and planning is a little bit more diverse, at least with gender. We've got other issues with diversity and racial diversity, but I don't know. I would love to see people sort of challenge engineering supremacy to design public spaces. Like I used to do a presentation where I'd be like, here's the center of Dayton, right? It's like a 9-lane road. This is the center of your downtown. And like, did you get a bunch of people together to decide how it would look? No, it was like one guy's decision, right? So I don't know, it's sort of hard. It's a sort of a hard challenge. I think legally, engineers do have a lot of power, but that doesn't mean, sorry, equipment failure. That doesn't mean as planners, we can just absolve ourselves. We have to be advocates, and we have to do what we can. And in some areas, and in some cities in particular, I think planners have a lot of power in some of the more progressive cities, and in those places, we also see some of the same equity issues that I've been talking about.
Awesome. We are about to close things out. I want to thank you, Angie, for again giving me the opportunity to be a part of this whole book process with you. It's been an honor. But before we close out, we want to announce the 2 winners who will receive copies of your book. First up is Carmen Wilson. Next, we have Marco Gorini, and Carmen Wilson. Both of you will be emailed Buy America Walks to receive the copies of your book. I guess they'll be asking for your address via email. Angie, someone has asked that you put up the slide showing the discount for your book. They would like to see the discount page again.
Yeah. Sorry, let me see. There, can you see that?
Yes, leave that up. You started the book with the prediction. I would like to end this discussion by giving you an opportunity to predict what you think will take place in terms of transportation and mobility post-COVID or post-pandemic. Give us a view of what do you think will happen here as we adjust to the new normal. Will pedestrian injuries and fatalities continue to increase? Will they decrease or remain the same? Or any other predictions you would like to make during this time? You're 1 for 1, so you might as well go for it.
Yeah, well, first I just want to say thank you so much too. You've been like such an important partner on this project and so supportive, and like your ideas I think really helped shape the book, and I really appreciate your leadership. So back to the question, which I'm losing. Okay, so I think like if nothing happens, if nothing changes, we're going to continue to see pedestrian deaths rise. I think there could be a blip, you know, if we have a recession, but I would expect these demographic changes that are happening, these changes to cars, they're not showing any signs of changing. So we could, I think it's like going to be a new normal where pedestrian deaths are higher and could continue to rise unless something changes. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future right now, though. Like, I think one big question is what's going to happen with the presidential race. If we have a new administration, it's not like completely a game changer, but I think a Biden administration would be much, much friendlier on this issue than another Trump administration.
Why is that?
The Trump administration has already, I read about it in the book. They've reduced funding for biking and walking to the extent that they can. They tried to actually eliminate funding for biking and walking, or they proposed that. And sorry, my internet freaked out a little. So they tried to eliminate funding. They have succeeded in reducing funding, and they've also blocked some vehicle regulation improvements that could have addressed this issue with SUVs, or started to address this issue with SUVs. The Obama administration had some issues implementing their agenda, as we all know, but we're pretty forward thinking about this. So I would expect a Biden administration to be much friendlier. Now, that said, the presidential administration doesn't set budgets, Congress does. So what happens with the Senate is really important too. And federal policy is just part of this, right? But I do think the formulas and the funding right now that's coming down, the automatic thing is just to do a big highway project. So that's what people are doing. And even if a suburb, like if there's a suburb in Northeast Ohio that gets concerned about this and they really do want to address it, the question of where the funding comes from is tricky. There's not an automatic pool of funding that's coming out to this, but I think we could make a big change with a relatively small amount of money if somebody in the Senate or the administration got excited about it and had the sort of power to implement that. And as I talk about in the book, it's become very polarized, this issue, by political party, unfortunately.
So what would you say quickly to those who say politics are local?
I mean, I do think that's true. I do think that's true. But like, you know, where I live is in a city like Cleveland. It's very poor, you know. There's so many pressing issues, right? This is not at the top of the agenda in Cleveland, and you know, like right now, it shouldn't be. But we only have 2 people that do all of our traffic stuff in Cleveland. 2 or 3 guys. Whereas in New York City, they have, you know, hundreds of people working, and you know, some other cities have a lot more resources. So I do think we need better federal and state partners on this, and that federal policy does matter.
So how can the people continue to follow you, Angie? I put out a call telling everyone to follow Angie. So how and where can they follow you?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm on Twitter a lot. My Twitter is kind of embarrassing, but
Why is that?
I don't know. Just, but it's a lot of people follow me on Twitter. It's at Schmangy, again, embarrassing. But like I mentioned, I'm trying to get into doing some consulting now. I launched my own firm. It's called 3MPH Planning and Consulting, and there's a website, 3mphplanning.com. I'm planning to do a little bit of blogging there eventually, so that's a good way to follow along. And also, I'm going to continue doing some writing and a handful of publications, I think, as well.
Well, I mean, you broke America Walks Internet today. We had the max number of participants here for the majority of today's discussion. I think it would be kind to have you back and let you respond only to questions from participants, and not necessarily a facilitated discussion, because there's so much interest in the book and what you've done. We want to thank you again for coming. We want to thank our sponsors. And I want to quickly remind everyone that donations are encouraged in order for America Walks to continue doing the great work that they're doing. Everyone, please give Angie a virtual hand clap, letting her know how much we appreciate her coming today. So thank you for that. Our next webinar will be September. You're welcome. Our next webinar will be September 30th, 2020, from 3 p.m. Eastern Time or 12 p.m. Pacific Time, excuse me. The topic is Youth Leading the Way, Inspiring Stories of Youth Creating Safe, Accessible Neighborhood. Again, my name is Charles Brown, board member with America Walks. It's been a pleasure. Everyone, please enjoy your week. Take care.